Spoiler alert, there is no winner. There's never a winner. As phones get more expensive and the cameras on our phones get better, we're increasingly talking about more specialized photo and video use. I've said it before and I'll say it again. If your camera needs are take phone out of pocket, push shutter, put phone back in pocket, you really should not be spending more than a Pixel A series. And that includes you iPhone users out there too. There's no reason to spend $900 plus to cover the basics. But the flip side, we have some terrific phone cameras out now that can deliver on their promises for improving content creation and journalism. In the right hands, phones today are closing in on the performance of smaller sensor mirrorless cameras. I'll rarely leave the house now with my interchangeable lens systems, and I find fewer and fewer compromises for really finishing my work while I'm benefiting from lighter pack weight and faster editing capabilities. Two of the top options this year in this conversation, the Xiaomi 13 Ultra and the Sony XPERIA 1 Mark V. Definitely spoiling some of my end of the year or wrap-up content, but these two phones are already top of the list as my favorite camera solutions of 2023. But I'm pitting these two against each other, not just to do some pixel peeping, but to talk about camera philosophy. This is not an oranges to oranges fight, using the same sensors or having the same capabilities or even the same focus. It's a look at two companies with very different strategies. And this highlights my hypothesis from the top of this video. There is never a winner. You want to get the right features for your needs. And starting off that conversation, let's look at the hardware. Quad camera versus triple camera, but they're all Sony sensors on both phones. The Xiaomi 13 Ultra looks more impressive on base specs. 50 megapixels all around on all four sensors. The main wide camera is that beast 1-inch type sensor with a 2-stage aperture. And this is the only quad camera where the 3 companion sensors, the ultra wide and the 2 telephotos, are all matched sensors. Now, they're not the biggest sensors we've ever seen on each of those companion pieces, but it's a big perk how consistent all 3 sensors are. The Sony ultra wide is about the same size, but the telephotos are bigger than the Xperia's zoom lens. So, bigger sensors with more megapixels. I guess the Xiaomi wins. Thanks for watching. Make sure you smash that bell icon, subscribe, drop comments. What do you think about this video? And I'll catch y'all on the next comparison. Kidding! Still talking about hardware, Sony is working a different tech angle. The main camera on the Xperia is a completely new sensor technology. Even though it's a little bit smaller, it's built to maximize light, and all 3 sensors are high-speed readout. Supports faster burst photo rates, better autofocus, higher video data rate, and 4K at up to 120 frames per second. So some might be disappointed to only see 3 cameras on the back of an Xperia, but the telephoto lens actually zooms. The lens elements actually move to change the field of view. The Xiaomi dual telephotos resemble a 75mm and a 120mm equivalent lenses. The Sony zooms from an 85 to a 125 with actual real optical transition in between those 2 stages. The hardware philosophy kind of breaks down to a fight between bigger matched sensors against faster sensors. So we should talk about controlling those sensors. The camera apps are similarly different. Xiaomi has everything in one app. Sony continues to use 3 different apps for specific shooting needs. As a very general trend, we'd point to a Xiaomi as a more processing-heavy platform, and Sony as a more camera-like style of image output. I'd say that still holds true, but we've seen Xiaomi, with Leica, push towards less aggressive HDR color and more filters to look like film. And Sony is adding some long-requested fun processing options, brighter color and exposure, and a more aggressive night mode. Sony has a basic point-and-shoot mode for low-level needs, but the apps on an Xperia are laid out to be more like a standalone mirrorless camera. You can get really granular into photo and video controls. The Xiaomi is no slouch for that manual stuff, but putting everything into one app is a lot to navigate, and it can kind of take a sec to get a feel for the flow of operating that app and switching modes and finding features. I think the Sony is better for focusing on a specific task where you cannot accidentally slide into another mode. I think the Xiaomi is more convenient to double tap a power button and have all your options available through one interface. Again, I wouldn't say there's a winner, more different strokes for different folks, but I think now is a good time we should look at a few photo samples. The trickiest aspect of producing this comparison, the time I had both phones together, most of that time we had really overcast weather here in Southern California and quite a bit of rain too. Finding those little pockets of daylight, the Xperia is a really lovely camera-like shooting experience. Now, patches of sun, big fluffy white clouds, a landscape in shade with a hill in light, and we're not ratcheting that HDR look. The clouds aren't getting twisted into higher contrast that would make them look more like storm clouds. The shadows aren't getting overly boosted, which would change the feel of what this landscape really looked like. The image isn't popping, but in a funny way, it becomes a more dynamic image because the phone is not trying to make everything bright. But we see little hints of Sony juicing a bit more, like this old busted baseball at the park with this stitching, the red popping just a little bit more. But it's not the extreme color manipulation. And we're not seeing the yellow in our greens getting lifted. The grass doesn't look overly lime colored. The blue sky has an appropriate gradient. Photos have a softer touch to them where the sharpening is there. We are sharpening up the raw files, but it's a little more subtle. We're not ratcheting hard lines on our subject. I like the Sony style directly out of the camera, and I think it gives you a better base to work with if you do want to slap on a filter or some heavier edits in your favorite social media apps. Plus, the raw files, fantastic to work with. Comparing against the Xiaomi is tricky to sum up all the different flavors of processing you can toggle on the 13 Ultra, but generally I stick with Leica Authentic to kind of emulate some of the things I like about shooting on the Sony. It's a softer looking processing. It's going for more of a film look. And even for walking back the unicorn puke, the Xiaomi is going to give a harder and more contrasty look in these bright daylight shots. A similar example of what I'm talking about, but from a different angle, white, fluffy, overcast clouds getting pushed a bit more gray. You can see how bright the sun is on the ground. The sky was not that dark on the day. It's one of my biggest gripes about HDR is where it changes the characteristics of the scene that we were looking at. Now, moving indoors, we can look at a few things at the same time. This is a dimmer restaurant lighting and using a subject closer to the minimum focusing distance of each lens. The Sony is incredibly close to the depth of field of the Xiaomi. It's one of my favorite features of a 1-inch type sensor is how shallow the depth of field can get. And here, Sony is just behind. While using a smaller sensor, they're getting a lot closer than I would have thought they would. The distance from the edge of the cup to the little wafer cookie, the cookie is already falling out of focus. The Xiaomi's gonna have it beat, but not by as much as I was expecting. Exploring the whole frame, I think the Xiaomi has slightly nicer looking bokeh balls, but the focus fall off is gorgeous on both of these phones. Here we can see the Xiaomi is painting in more of that HDR software dynamic range and delivers, funnily, the darker, contrastier shot. Sony, with dim indoor lighting, actually pops the brighter exposure. Exposing for the cup, we can see the background is brighter too. I can't really overstate this. We usually don't see this kind of output comparing Sony against other phone cameras. It's rare for me to say Sony has the brighter and more colorful HDR image. That felt kind of weird coming out of my face. Case in point, a light bulb shot at night, each phone left to its own metering. Sony is going to deliver the darker image, but blowing out the lighting element a little less than the Xiaomi, which is going to flare a little bit more. Getting into really dark nighttime shots, this is the biggest area of improvement for Sony. We now have a more dramatic night mode. It lifts detail, reduces noise, and finds color where even our eyes might struggle with the scene in front of us. This is definitely the area where the Xiaomi processing can outpace the Sony, but we've never seen an Xperia land this close before. Sony is still more camera-like, where the Xiaomi is doing a lot more HDR layering, stacking images to reduce light flaring and blown out sections around windows. It's reducing the noise more aggressively, but again, the big complaint about Xperia in years past, it should have better processing and HDR and better low light performance. This is a huge improvement year over year, especially considering the difference in sensor size between the Xperia and the 13 Ultra. But that's HDR night mode image stacking. Sony's claim is better low light performance directly from this radical new sensor technology. I've been praising 1-inch sensor phones because more surface area should help us soak up more light. I've been really skeptical with previous claims from companies like Samsung and Apple when a new sensor is touted as so significantly better at processing light that they didn't need to make it bigger. We rarely see that claim play out in a practical way for consumers. Better sensors are better, but often the more dramatic improvements come from increasing sensor size. But Sony is a little different. I think it kind of plays out for Sony here. Again, this is not oranges to oranges, and I'm letting the cameras meter their own shots. But whatever Sony is doing here allows for a lower ISO to be used in capturing a similar handheld shot. Handheld. Okay, so the Sony exposure was twice as long at 1/4 of a second, but the image stabilization on that lens was capable of keeping the shot sharp. The Xiaomi cranked the ISO to 12,800, the Sony shot at ISO 5000, and the Sony shot is brighter. So we should totally expect the longer shutter to produce a brighter image, but the longer shutter at less than half the ISO is what's critical here. I really like this metering. The phone is making some very good decisions. When the Xiaomi can use some fancier software, when it can stack more images and process all that data, it's better at finishing a bright, sharp night image in the camera. But for folks who are comfortable editing photos, this is a much closer fight than I was anticipating based on those sensor size differences. Shifting gears, there are also some significant differences in video immediately. If you're interested at all in shooting 8K, you need to skip the Sony this year as there is no option for 8K video. Both phones shoot terrific 4K video, and during my video recording torture test, the Sony is shooting at more than twice the bitrate of the Xiaomi when both phones are capturing 4K at 60 frames per second. That'll eat up storage a lot faster. It'll eat up your phone storage more than twice as fast as the Xiaomi, but a higher data rate can help when you're editing and color grading and when you might need to mix footage with other cameras. The hook for the Sony is being able to shoot 4K at up to 120 frames per second. It produces some of the most flexible footage we can capture from a phone, where you can move easily from real time to 1/4 slow motion natively in a 30 frame per second video timeline. And both of these phones are kinda delicious for their consistency. Almost every mode and setting and feature is accessible across all the rear cameras. All the Xiaomi cameras can shoot 8K. All the Sony cameras can shoot 4K 120. Not many phones deliver on those exotic features to the companion sensors in the same way. When you add in perks like telephoto actually zooming, the higher data rate, and Sony's scary good eye-tracking autofocus, I have to give Sony the edge, a slight edge for video production, especially for the video-focused professional who might want to use their Sony phone as a monitor to record footage from another mirrorless camera, like say you have a Sony Alpha. You can move quickly from a production camera to a discrete phone camera with similar color science and edit that footage together really easily. And wrapping up these comparison points, while I've shown some areas where Sony is impressing with features we don't often talk about in shallow phone reviews, the Xiaomi is a bleeding edge platform in its own right. As mentioned, the companion sensors are stronger at the HDR game than the Sony's, and all 4 sensors match for features like high resolution modes. If you want 50 megapixels, all 4 cameras are gonna give you the 50 megapixels. And while I really like the physical zoom on the Sony, keeping the back of that phone a little simpler, a little cleaner, the larger telephotos on the Xiaomi are more practical in darker conditions. I really like using telephoto sensors like on the Xiaomi Ultras and the Pixel 7 Pro indoors, where the lower light image quality helps a lot for candid photography. You want to take a photo of someone across a living room, but you don't want to shove your phone right in their face. You can kind of sit back a little ways and capture a nicer image. It's not something you can do as easily when you're using a smaller telephoto sensor that was designed for more reach. And while I've been seriously impressed with the new sensor technology on Sony's main camera, the Xiaomi's dual stage aperture is a formidable feature to find on a phone. These sensors are so big now and competing well against smaller mirrorless cameras like my Micro Four Thirds shooters. The extra control helps tremendously when you're composing your shot. You don't always need the shallowest depth of field, and stopping down improves sharpness across the entire frame. Plus, it helps rein in our shutter speed for video, so movement won't look quite as choppy because you don't have to use a silly fast shutter to contend with bright daylight. Whew, so that was a lot of talking, and there's so much more each camera brings to the table. Both are devices that I feel live up to the labels we put on premium expensive phones. Hilariously, neither of these are called Pro, but I feel they contribute to legitimately professional grade content creation. These should genuinely be incorporated in different disciplines, especially discrete photography and mobile journalism. Yet for both being practical content creating tools, they kind of bookend the premium market. They really could not be more different if each of their manufacturers had sat down in a boardroom and tried to design the differentest phones they could from each other. It's just so much fun to say, there is no winner here. The philosophy of each camera matters more than Pixel peeping a couple of side-by-side shots looking for which has the better colors. For folks more interested in photo composition tools, and maybe you shoot stills a bit more than you shoot video and you want the more balanced platform for all lighting conditions, I'd lean more towards the Xiaomi. For folks shooting more video and who are maybe capturing more action and movement, I'd much more strongly consider the Sony. Both are very good at almost any task you might want to throw at them, but genuinely, when I'm running around and chasing after my daughter, I'd rather have the XPERIA. And when I'm taking pretty pictures of landscapes or flower macro shots, I'd really rather have the Xiaomi. What should be clear though, stepping up to the Pro and Ultra tier of phones, you have very specific flavors that will match very specific kinds of consumers. I still do not believe that users get a dramatically better point and shoot experience spending this much when you start climbing to these price tags. You want to spend $1,400 on a phone? I believe it is better than buying an inexpensive mid-ranger, but if your shooting style literally is what I described, take phone from pocket, push shutter, put phone back in pocket, maybe you didn't even tap to focus, and you only do that a couple of times a week, you really should not be spending more than a Pixel 6a. Does not matter if we're talking Android or iPhone. Your photography experience doesn't get much better by spending that much more. Again, especially if we're really working at that kind of base level that tech reviewers seem to assume is average for all users. The more you consider your shot, adjust your frame, and try to capture more of a photograph, that's where these tools really shine. The photographer's style matters a lot more than just the phone specs on a website or on the side of a box. I think this year, in 2023, the two phones that show off those differences the best, the Xiaomi 13 Ultra and the Xperia 1 Mark V. And of course, I want to hear from you. If each phone camera system has a unique philosophy, what kind of camera do you want to see bolted to the back of a phone? Yeah, I think it's interesting seeing Leica and Hasselblad and Zeiss collaborate with phone manufacturers, and I think we're overdue a Canon or a Nikon or Panasonic also trying their hands at something mobile. What do you think is missing from the phone to really take mobile photography that next step into professional territory? Drop me the tasty of hot takes down below and smash that bell icon on your way down to the comments. As always, thanks so much for watching, for sharing these videos, subscribing to the channel. All of the support lately has been absolutely fantastic. Those of you who are clicking on links in my video descriptions, maybe you've hit my home site, SomeGadgetGuy.com. Maybe you're reading my really fancy smartphone photography book to get some tips and tricks and some better tools to improve your mobile content. Take better photos, smartphone photography for noobs, now available on Amazon Kindle, just updated for 2023. And the Xiaomi 13 Ultra has thrown a little wrench that a couple passages of my book are now already out of date. It's a fun read. I put a lot of work into sprucing up the book, and I'm already writing new passages to put out at the end of the year. And of course, a heartfelt thank you to the list of names scrolling by on your screen from my Patreon. That's patreon.com/SomeGadgetGuy. This list is basically the coolest collection of tech pals in the universe, and they get exclusive access to my camera deep dives when I get those polished up and produced. We're working on the Xiaomi 13 Ultra next. It's gonna be a really long camera review. These folks are basically the coolest tech pals out there, so I hope you'll check them out. Now, you know where you can find me around the rest of the internet. I produce my podcast on the Twitch for the time being. We'll see if any changes to that occur soon. I'm spending a lot more time on the Mastodons, and I'm sharing photos on the Flickrs, a little less so these days on the Twitters and the Facebooks and the Instagrams, and I will catch you all on the next video.